right. Well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's live Q&A session with astronaut Terry Virts. Today's event is brought to you by Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants and COVID Promise. So Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants is an education nonprofit. We bring science, adventure, exploration, and conservation live into classrooms across North America through virtual speakers and virtual field trip events. You can check out some of our events at www.exploringbytheseat.com. We usually do 3 to 4 live events a day. COVID Promise is a grassroots nonprofit initiative to spread a message of hope and optimism for economic resilience and recovery during this trying time. By spreading the promise and not the virus, we will be stronger, defeat the virus, and rebuild our economy. To make your COVID promise, visit www.covidpromise.org. All right. Well, my name is Joe Grabowski, and I'm going to be your host for today. Of course, we have an amazing event lined up, spending a little time hanging out with Terry Virts today. So Terry is a celebrated NASA astronaut, pilot of the Space Shuttle Endeavour, and a crew member of the Russian Soyuz spacecraft. He spent 200 consecutive days in space as commander of the International Space Station, one of the longest continuous space missions of any NASA astronaut. Terry helped install the Outpost 360-degree observation module, the cupola, which allowed him to take more photos than any astronaut before him. And this helped give him a deeper understanding of our planet's beauty, climate, and place in the universe. And Terry's going to share a little bit of that perspective with us today. So Terry, it's so great to have you joining us live from Texas. We're excited to get to know you a little bit better. We've got tons joining in on YouTube. We've got a few lucky kids joining us from across the US at home. And we are ready to spend a little time with you.
Thanks, Joe. This is so great to be here. Thank you to Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. This is a really cool organization. I know you and I have done several of these before. And thanks to COVID Promise for putting this together. They've come together, you know, people from all different businesses and backgrounds have worked on this organization on their own time, volunteered their resources and time to focus on getting us through this, especially economically, which is what, you know, we're all going to need. So it's a really great way to support people. And I know there's a lot of kids who are not going through school right now and they're home, and there's a lot of aspects about space flight that cover just about everything in school. And so I'm going to talk about a space mission, some of the things that I saw from space. And most importantly, we're going to do Q&A because kids always have amazing questions at the end. And my challenge to them is to come up with a question I've never heard. That's really hard because I've heard a lot. So before we take any more time, I'm going to jump right in. I'm sharing my screen. And just let me know if you can see it okay. How's that?
All right. We are full screen.
Okay. So I want to start off, every good astronaut presentation starts off with launch. And those who have heard my talk before have heard me talk about things, but I had been a fighter pilot and a test pilot. And the first time I got on that space shuttle, it was incredible. There's so much noise and power from the engines. I remember when the engines lit up, I remember thinking, I have never heard that sound before. That is a loud engine. I've flown a lot of F-16s and F-15s and, you know, big fighter jet engines. There's nothing like these engines. And when the solid rocket motors, the two big white motors on the side of the shuttle go light off, there's so much thrust and power behind them. It feels like somebody just grabbed you and is shaking you as hard as they can. And the shuttle itself probably weighed about 4 million pounds, but it put out about 7 million pounds of thrust. So for those of you in physics, you can figure out the acceleration. But if you've got more force pushing on the bottom of something, it's going to move, and it's going to move pretty quickly. So the shuttle went up to what we call 3 Gs, which is like 3 times the force of gravity on Earth. So the way you can experience that is just lay on your back and have a couple of your buddies lay on top of you. And that feeling of getting smashed is what it feels like when you launch, and have them shake you while they're doing that, which is hard to do. But it's actually hard to breathe. You actually have to push out. You have to physically push out on your chest muscles in order to be able to breathe in. And then as soon as you stop pushing, your chest squashes and you breathe out. So breathing in is a lot of work, but breathing out is really easy. And so the experience between the noise and the vibration, it was at my first launch, both of my launches actually were at 4 in the morning. So they were both at nighttime. And when the shuttle rocket engines lit up, it turned the nighttime into daylight. A good project for the kids to do out there, Google STS-130, and you'll just see a lot of home movies that people put on YouTube, and you can see people screaming and cheering, and there were probably about 1 million people watching on the east coast of Florida, hundreds of thousands for sure. But the launching on a space shuttle or any rocket is highly recommended. It's a pretty cool thing to do. And this picture right here is one of my favorite pictures of all time. A guy named James Vernicatella took this photo, and that's the moon there. You can see when the solid rocket boosters came off, you can see us flying through some clouds. I wrote a book called View from Above, was my first book. And the whole chapter 1 is about this picture, all the different things that were happening. A really cool thing about this picture is he let the shutter open up for probably 8 minutes or so for the time that we were flying into space. So all those star trails, you can see how much the Earth rotates during a space shuttle launch or any rocket launch. The reason there's star trails is because the Earth was rotating during those few minutes. It's not just sitting still. Nothing in the universe is sitting still. You know, planets aren't fixed, stars aren't fixed, galaxies aren't fixed. Everything is moving and changing constantly. And that's true on the galactic scale. And as we've all seen recently, it's true on our personal scales too. But nothing is ever fixed. And it's pretty cool when you understand that, to see how the world works. Both of my flights, my first one on the space shuttle and my second one, almost the 200-day one on the Soyuz, took me here to the International Space Station. And this is another good project if you're keeping track for kids. Find an app that'll tell you when the space station is going to fly over, and go outside in the evening after the sun sets or in the morning before the sun rises. Probably better in the evening after the sun sets for your parents. But just you can see when the space station flies over. It's amazing. It's a massive spaceship, almost 1 million pounds. And it's bigger than a football field. So when you see it, you're actually seeing the sunlight reflect off of it. And on that first flight, I actually finished building it. We built it piece by piece by piece. It was about 30,000 pounds or 15 tons, 15,000 kilograms per mission of modules that we live in, or this external truss, the solar arrays, or the thermal arrays. There's Russian modules, there's European modules, there's Japanese modules. The Canadians built a robotic arm. The Americans built a lot of the biggest part of the space station, but it's very much an international project. So I had the honor and privilege of finishing it. And then I got to go back and live. I spent over 7 months of my life on that spaceship right there. This is a video, I'll just let it play while I talk. This gives you an idea of what it's like in zero gravity. So I'm putting a camera together, which is kind of my passion. I love photography. I love making movies. And this is a camera that I used for an IMAX movie called A Beautiful Planet. You can actually get the Blu-ray if you want. It's a really cool IMAX movie. But you can just see things are floating. So you have to stabilize yourself with your feet or with your hands or something, because if you don't do that, you'll just float away just like the camera is. And it takes a lot of time to learn how to float. You can carry things with your feet and you move with your hands, kind of like the opposite of how we were designed to work down here on Earth. But it's really, really fun. There's a steep learning curve. It takes probably a few weeks before you're really good at being an astronaut, at being a spaceman. But it was a pretty cool learning experience for me. And once you get good at it, it's really satisfying to be able to float and move things. And you know, if your buddy needs a wrench, you don't have to walk over and give it to him. You just float it to him and it'll fly down the module, and he reaches up and grabs it. So being in weightlessness is a lot of fun, really cool. There's a lot about life on Earth that also exists in space. This is a great picture of me giving my crewmate Samantha Cristoforetti, an Italian astronaut, a haircut. But that was a complicated operation. I had to learn, I spent hours on Earth going to a hairdresser, learning how to do a woman's haircut, which was kind of crazy. But in space, your hair sticks up, especially if you have long hair, especially women, their hair sticks up. So it's a different thing getting the haircut. Pretty soon down here on Earth, you know, none of us are getting haircuts now, so my hair is going to be like that pretty soon. But it also required Anton Shkaplerov, my Russian crewmate. He came down with the vacuum cleaner, and so I would cut the hair, it would go flying off, and he would suck it up in the vacuum, which is pretty cool. Sleeping in space is another part of life that you just don't have on Earth because you're floating. So I would get myself into this sleeping bag, zip it up entirely so it was over my head. This is for the sake of the picture, but in real life, I would put myself inside the sleeping bag. Sometimes you put these little foam earplugs in to keep the noise out. On the space shuttle, when there was people all around, on the space station, I had my own little cabin. So you can't see the doors, but imagine that little box I'm in. You can close the doors and have your own private space. Um, that silver bag that's Velcroed to the wall is actually a water bag. So if you wake up in the middle of the night and you need some water or something, you just reach over, grab it, and slap it against the wall, and the Velcro will keep it there, which is kind of cool. There's a bunch of bungee cords, those black cords. I would keep a bag of Reese's peanut butter cups, or some snacks or whatever in there. So your sleeping area is really great, and I loved floating. And in this picture, there's a black bungee cord that's keeping me attached. But in real life, when I slept, I would get rid of the cord and I would just float and kind of spin. It's a great way to sleep. I love sleeping in weightlessness. And the point of the space station, the mission of the space station is science. And so this is a picture of something called a glove box. When we're doing interesting experiments there that are dangerous, you do them inside of a glove box. Now we have a bigger glove box that 2 astronauts can work on at the same time. But the basic idea is to keep it contained, because say you have some dangerous chemicals. I worked with E. coli and salmonella, very dangerous bugs, just kind of like COVID, right? You don't want to let E. coli, food poisoning, get out, and you don't want to let salmonella get out. So we were trying to make a vaccine for those, just like what we're trying to do with coronavirus. And so I did all that work inside this glove box. But anything you can study on Earth, you can do in space. And while I was there, I did 250 different experiments. I also didn't spend all of my time inside. I went outside, and this is me in my spacesuit. Going out in space is an amazing experience. Chapter 7 in View from Above is all about spacewalking. It's the longest chapter. We could do probably 5 of these exploring by the seat of your pants things, just talking about spacewalking. There's so much going on. The suit itself, the technology is amazing. It's very similar to what the Apollo guys use. So we're using kind of the same stuff we've had for 50 years, but it works. Keeping track of all your equipment is really difficult. That stuff is heavy and bulky. And it's an amazing experience. Like I said, we can talk about spacewalking for hours. But that view is so spectacular. I've never seen anything like being outside. I felt like I was seeing things that humans weren't meant to see. I felt like I was seeing creation from the beginning. But most of spacewalking is very busy. There's a lot of work to do. I talked about it being an international crew. This is my crew when I was the commander. 2 Americans, 3 Russians, and an Italian. These guys were great. The best part of being in space was hanging out with my crew. I love these guys. In fact, I just got a text from Gennady. Gennady's the guy with the big heat miser haircut in the bottom. He texted me about 5 minutes ago and said, "Happy Astronauts Day. Today's the anniversary of Alan Shepard flying." And he just texted me a few minutes ago to remind me of that. So we still stay in touch. We're all still very good friends. This is pretty cool. Samantha's boyfriend sent us all Christmas gifts. And so I got a set of Legos. That's Terry Virts Lego. It has my name on the name tag. And he knows I'm a sports guy, so he gave me a Lego football, which I love. But I'm a big Lego fan. In fact, I've still got my space shuttle Lego that I've never built. I got to do that with my son. But that was pretty cool having my own Lego. This is a message that I really want to share with you guys and make sure that you hear this, because it's really important. My journey to space did not start at the launch pad. It started when I was a little kid. The first book I ever read was about Apollo. And as I grew up, I had posters of airplanes and rockets on my wall. And I was very lucky because my parents supported me. They didn't really know that much about how to be an astronaut, but they did things like they got me a telescope and didn't tell me anything about it. So I had to figure out how to use it on my own. They got me a computer, an old TRS-80, and I had to learn how to program that thing on my own. So being able to be supported but also having to learn things on my own is why I am where I am today, because it sparked a curiosity, but it also forced me to be, curious on my own and learn how to do things on my own. And that kind of self drive is what got me to where I am today. And as I grew up, I always wanted to be an astronaut. I ended up going on to be an F-16 pilot, like I talked about, and a test pilot. But along the way, a lot of people told me, that's a crazy dream. That's never going to happen. And of course, it is a crazy dream. I mean, very few people get to be astronauts. But I had a kind of an epiphany when eventually I got selected by NASA. And a lot of my fellow Air Force guys didn't even apply because they thought they didn't have enough experience or they weren't ready. They wanted to be an astronaut just as badly as I did. They were all probably smarter than I am, but they didn't apply because they just didn't feel like it was the right time or whatever. And I ended up getting picked, and they didn't. And the lesson learned there for everybody is don't tell yourself no. If there's some dream that you have, whatever it is, if you want to start your own company or discover how to cure cancer or be an astronaut or raise the family you want to have, whatever your dream is, you have to go for it. Because if you don't, you won't get it. And if you do, you might. And so that's the lesson that I have is don't tell yourself no. So I'm going to share real quick just a few pictures that I took. Photography was my favorite thing. I spent a lot of time in this module. I actually installed this module on my first mission. It's called the cupola. And you can see me kind of looking up at the Earth. And that's because the cupola is on the bottom of the space station. So you have to, when you look up, the Earth is up there. So these are just some of the pictures I took. I ended up taking more pictures than anybody ever. And I helped make that IMAX movie, A Beautiful Planet. And this was just my way to share space and my mission with people down here on Earth. So I always start off with this picture. This is Typhoon Maisak. It was one of the strongest storms ever. It was the strongest ever Pacific tropical storm. This massive Category 5 monster of a storm, hundreds and hundreds of miles across. The eye was so well defined. It was just this beautiful and frightening thing all at once. And I love this picture of Earth. I think this tells the story of Earth more than any other picture I took, just about, because the story of life on Earth, anyway, is water. And in this picture, you can see the ocean. That's the Pacific Ocean. That orange is sun glint, so it's just the sun reflecting off the ocean, making it look kind of yellow-orange. That thin blue line in the background is our atmosphere, and everything above that is the rest of the universe. It's bigger than you can even imagine. And there's nowhere out there that can have human life without a spacesuit, nowhere that we know of. There's certainly nowhere in the solar system that people can just walk around. And we've never, who knows if there's other planets where we could just walk around without a spacesuit on. So above that line is this massive universe where we can't even survive for a few seconds. And below it is every human that's ever been. And it really tells a story that we need to take care of our planet. There's no plan B, there's only plan A. So it's really important to take care of Earth. And then those clouds are also water, right? They're water vapor. So no matter where you are over the Earth in orbit, if you look down, and even if it's the Sahara Desert or the outback, the Western Australian outback, you will find water somewhere, even if it's just in a few puffy clouds. And that really is the story of life on Earth. Speaking of the desert, this is the Adrar province. It's in northwestern Africa, part of the Sahara and the Atlas Mountains. It's between Morocco and Algeria. And it is a gorgeous place. The colors are so spectacular, this orange and black look to it. But those sand dunes are something that really blew me away. You can see sand dunes from space, especially in Saudi Arabia, the Saudi desert, in this part of the Sahara Desert. But in Namibia too. Namibia has the biggest sand dunes on Earth. They're 700 meters tall. They're like mountains. And it really surprised me that you could see that from space. I didn't know you could. This is another thing that surprised me about Earth. If this is over Central Africa at nighttime, there's a few places, Africa and South America and the South Pacific, but if it's at nighttime and you let your eyes adjust, you see these thunderstorms. These are lightning flashes. Like, I'm just going to go show you that again. tens of flashes per second. There's so much energy and power in these storms. It's just amazing. But another thing to see at night, this is a pass over Northern Europe, over the United Kingdom, over Scandinavia into Russia. And as you look off to the north, that green band is the Northern Lights. So there's London down below. The Earth is lit up from moonlight. So this isn't the sun, this is moonlight. You can see all that snow in Norway up there. There's Stockholm and going into Helsinki. But you can see the green wave kind of flowing and rippling. There's St. Petersburg, and here comes Moscow and the snowy Russian Siberia. But our eyes are designed to work in black and white at night and color during the day. But even though it's nighttime, you can still perceive that green and red color, which is pretty amazing. And beyond the aurora, when you just look out, there are so many stars out there. I like stars. I like constellations. I like that kind of thing. I could never pick out a constellation or a star at night. I could pick out the planets, but I could never make out the stars because there's so many billions of them. And this is just a view of a moon set. I probably took 100 different moon set time lapses. Each one is different because it's a different phase of the moon. Sometimes the moon's in front of us in our orbit. Sometimes it's off to the side. In this case, it's off to the side. But you can talk to your physics teachers about refraction there. There's a lot of chemistry and physics going on in that picture. Seeing the moon set behind the clouds and turning blue as it does. This is a great picture. It's hard to even tell what it is, but it's over the Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, the big island. And as I was flying over, it just looks like ocean and these dark jungle islands. And all of a sudden, it was something called orbital noon. So the sun was right overhead. And as I looked down, it just exploded in light. And all of these rivers just came to life with the sunlight reflecting off of it. And all these rivers are flowing out of the jungle. And that white thing at the bottom is the ocean. So this is a picture of the middle of primitive Papua New Guinea. You know, people live in huts down there with grass skirts, no technology at all. And here I was in space, an astronaut taking a picture of them. It was a pretty profound moment. This is just a picture of Florida and the Caribbean. That blue turquoise look is so gorgeous. It's so unique. There's nowhere else on the planet that has as much. Every ocean has small little islands with this turquoise aqua color to it. But even the Great Barrier Reef doesn't come close to as green and blue as the Caribbean is. If you go on Google Maps or you look at a satellite view, you can really see how much of the Earth is very bright colored in that world. So I love taking pictures from space. It was kind of my favorite thing to do. This is the last one I took, and I took it. I looked at the camera and I said, "That's the best picture I'm ever going to take." And I took the card out, I downlinked it, and I went down and I came back to Earth because it was just I was done. It was such a beautiful picture. So with all that, Joe, I've been talking really fast for a long time. Maybe we can jump into some Q&A, some questions from the kids.
All right, that sounds good to me, Terry. We'll give you a little break for a second while I do a few introductions.
Okay.
All right. So if I can get you, Terry, to hit that stop screen share, we'll get you nice and full screen for us. I want to give a shout out to all the groups watching live on YouTube right now. I can see there's lots of groups joining us live. I want to give a quick shout out to some of those groups who have introduced themselves already. So in the US, we have groups in Texas, in Massachusetts, in Baltimore, Phoenix, Arizona, Maryland joining us. In Canada, we have groups in Ottawa, Toronto, Renfrew, Ajax, Blenheim, and Tillsonburg in Ontario, as well as Surrey, British Columbia, Alberta, Newfoundland. We have a few elementary schools joining us, so their students are tuning in. Fairview Glen Montessori School, Nolan Glen Hope Elementary. I'm sure there's lots more, so keep introducing yourselves, and I'm going to take a few of your questions. But we also have a few students joining us today, a few kids joining us from home, and we're going to take some of their questions live as well. So I think we're going to go to Lake Elmo, Minnesota first. We're going to talk to Izzy. Izzy is 9. Let me turn that microphone on. Hey, Izzy.
Hi.
How are you doing today?
Good.
All right.
Have you seen a meteorite in space?
Yes. Have you seen a meteorite in space? That's a great question. So there's a lot of things flying around out there. When I did my spacewalks, my 3 spacewalks, I would see little small craters all over the space station, everywhere. And that's either from dust or something coming in from the rest of the solar system, or sometimes it's like a paint chip or a screw or something left over from another rocket that hits us. And they're moving really fast, miles per second. So there's a lot of energy there. And on Earth, when you see meteorites, like if it's the Leonids or the Perseids, we just had a meteor shower last week. You look up and you see all these streaks across the sky. Well, in space, when you see them, you look down and you see the streaks, because what you're seeing is these particles hitting the atmosphere and burning up. And every once in a while, you'd be looking down and you'll see a little bright flash and a white streak. It would happen really fast. And it was really cool. And then I would think, ooh, except for that thing flew by me on the way down to Earth. So yes, you do see them, but when you see them, you have to look down and not up. Really, really good question.
All right. Thanks, Izzy. We might come back your way. So think of another one and be ready for us. I want to give a few more YouTube shout outs. We're going to take one from YouTube. We've got people in Delaware and Iowa joining us, as well as Guelph, Ontario, Burlington. But the question that I have here is from Ollie. And Ollie is wondering about your first spacewalk. When you opened that door, that hatch, how did you feel before you took that first step or out there?
It was a big deal. I had been in space for a few months, so I was used to weightlessness. But when you open the hatch, when I first went out, it was nighttime on Earth, but it was daylight for us. So the space station was up in the sunlight, but it was still dark below. So I couldn't see I couldn't see, and I had to go out feet first. This the way we are stuffed into the airlock. So I didn't like go out and to see this stuff, but I pulled myself out and then I looked around and I went, whoa. And a couple of astronauts had reported getting vertigo and just disoriented. So the very first thing I did, we have this tether, fall is the Russian word. It's about the length of your body. So I took it, I clipped it on a handrail, and I let go. And I was just floating in space, not touching anything. And I looked around and I said, okay, I'm good. I'm good. I took, and then I went back to work. But the very first thing I did was put the tether down, let go, and just make sure mentally I was okay. And I was, and then I went back to work.
All right, very cool. And thank you, Ollie, for that question. Now we're going to visit another student who's joining us live. We're going to go to Herndon, Virginia. We've got Faisal joining us. He is 9. Let me turn it on. Hey, Faisal, how are you?
I'm good. Mike, how are you?
I'm good, Faisal, really good. I love that part of the country, by the way. I'm jealous where you live.
So my question is that what's your favorite food in space?
My favorite food in space was, it's funny, almost every astronaut you ask will say the same thing, but it was shrimp cocktail. I love shrimp cocktail. But it's, for some reason, your taste buds change and we don't know exactly why, but the shrimp cocktail that NASA makes is dehydrated, so it's crunchy, and you have to stick it in a machine, it fills it up with water, and you mash it around, wait 10 minutes, and then it turns into whatever the food is. So the shrimp cocktail was really good, but the other thing I really liked was chocolate, because I love chocolate. So we had these,
too.
you love chocolate too?
Yeah, I love
we had chocolate brownies, and they're basically Little Debbie chocolate brownies, and that was the other thing I really loved. There's a funny picture, my crewmate Scott Kelly and I, he loves chocolate too, and we opened up this container of desserts, and it was supposed to last us for 2 weeks, and it probably weighs 10 or 15 pounds, and it has all kinds of different desserts that NASA made for us. And this was like it must have been the bottom of the dessert barrel back on Earth, because when they packed it, there was only one chocolate thing in the whole thing. It was one Little Debbie brownie. And so there's a picture, Scott and I cut it in half, and there's a picture of us. We're sad astronauts. We're very sad, kind of like Brad Pitt and Ad Astra. And there's like 2 brownies floating next to us. It was pretty funny because that was the only chocolate we had.
All right, Faisal, great question. And Terry, whenever you tell that story about the shrimp cocktails, for some reason, I always picture you drifting in the cupola with a shrimp cocktail in one hand and a camera in the other. That's the image that comes to mind. All right, let's meet another one of our students joining us today. We're going to go to Colin. Colin is 10 years old. He's hanging out in Salt Lake City, Utah. Let's get that microphone on. Hey, Colin.
Hi.
Hello.
My question is, what's the hardest thing about like living in space?
The hardest thing. Wow, people always ask me what's the best thing. You may have just asked the one that no one asks, that no one has asked. Getting to float is great, and the view is the best part about it. But the hardest thing is probably just being away from your friends and family. The daily schedule is pretty busy. Unfortunately, NASA makes you work. You can't just go up there and float around. So it was a long work day. It was a lot of work. But I like work, so that was okay. But I think being away from your, friends and family. I have kids. They were back on Earth, and so that can get kind of lonely.
All right, thank you, Colin. We're going to jump back to YouTube. We've got a question here from Catherine, and Catherine is wondering, when you came back to Earth, back on solid ground, how did it change your perspective? What was your kind of view on the world after having spent so much time above it?
Right. So this is a great question. This is kind of my mission in life, is sharing this different perspective that I have. I think one of the things that changed in me is that I'm less of a black and white guy. In my younger years, before spaceflight, everything was black and white and right and wrong. And I can really see different sides of arguments and people and culture. And, there's still right and wrong for sure. And some things are just wrong. But for the most part, I think I'm less of a black and white guy. And then when you see, one of the things I'd love to do is a TV show where I go and visit the crazy places that I saw from space. And the goal of that show, it would be interesting, and there's the environment, and it's, cool Antarctica and mountains and jungles, and that stuff would be interesting. But the point of that would be to show that people are people. Because, when you see Earth from space, it really is Earth. We really are living here on spaceship Earth. In this virus, for the first time ever in human history, we all have a common enemy. It's the coronavirus. And so I hope our leaders, we're kind of at this fork in the road. I hope our leaders can really focus on that. Let's fight this thing together. And because we've kind of been going in the other direction where we're dividing it too much. And I think that's a really important thing that world leaders need to do. And that's something that, we all need to push them. Hey guys, let's stop bickering and dividing, and let's start working together better. Good question. Absolutely, Terry. You can't see those boundaries we draw from space. That's for sure. Well, hey, let me add to that. Usually, I'll suffix that with usually, except there's a couple boundaries you can see. The North Korea, South Korea one is the most likely one. So when you see those, most of the Earth, you don't see boundaries, but when you see those, you can really see where things went wrong. Like, when there really are nations that are not functioning properly is when you can see those boundaries. But you're right, 99% you can't. And that's kind of the way, we want to, that should be the future we aspire to. All right, absolutely. So we're going to visit another group who's hanging out with us. Let's see. We're going to talk to, we talked to Colin. We're going to go to Preston. Preston is 14. He's hanging out in Pasadena, Maryland. Let me get his microphone turned on. Hey, Preston. How do you hear us, Preston? It looks like.
Oh, there you go. Go ahead. How long does it take for you to travel from Earth to space?
Good question. So how long does it take to get to space? By the way, Pasadena. So I flew in Aberdeen Ironbirds jersey on my first flight. So it's just down the road from Pasadena. I'm a big baseball guy. And Orioles jerseys. If you go to the Orioles ballpark right behind home plate, they've got my jersey with Buck Showalter's manager of the year and all this stuff. So anyway, a baseball aside, the definition of space, it depends on who defines it. Some people define it as 50 miles. like you get your Air Force wings above 50 miles. The international community defines it as 100 kilometers, which is 62 miles. But it's roughly that. So it takes a rocket just a few minutes to get that high. But to get into orbit, which is different than space, almost every rocket going into low Earth orbit takes about 8.5 minutes. So the space shuttle and the Soyuz were about the same. The Soyuz burned a little bit longer. The shuttle kind of burned out here and was still climbing, and it needed to do a couple more rocket burns to grow the orbit. The Soyuz went a little bit higher and turned the corner, and it was in orbit already when the engine shut down. So this is a long answer to your question, but roughly 8.5, sometimes 9 minutes before you're in a stable orbit. But the space tourist companies, here's another thing I'll throw out there. Guys like Virgin Galactic and Jeff Bezos and Blue Origin, hopefully, I think this year they're going to start flying people in the near future. If you got a couple $100,000 laying around, you can buy yourself a ticket to space. Or study hard, get a good job, and then in a few years from now, you'll be able to buy yourself a ticket into space. Yeah. Those missions they probably burn for about 3 or 4 minutes, and then the rocket will float for another 4 or 5 minutes, and then it comes straight back down into the atmosphere. In fact, today, on Astronaut's Day, on the anniversary of Alan Shepard's first flight, back in 1961, a couple weeks after Yuri Gagarin's first flight, his flight was the same thing. He went up and came straight down. It was a 15-minute flight, but he got into space, but only for a few minutes because he didn't have enough speed to get to that orbital velocity. So going into space is all about your speed, and you can get into low, just a few minutes of weightlessness at about Mach 5 times the speed of sound. But to get into orbit, you've got to go about Mach 25, and so that's much, 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 much harder to do.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you.
Sure. Good question. That's a long answer.
All right, let's grab another YouTube question. This is from some grade 5-6 students at St. Pius School in Thunder Bay, and they're wondering about communicating back to Earth. How often did you communicate with NASA, and what about friends and family?
So we're talking with not only NASA, but also the Russian Space Agency. There's mission control centers in Moscow, in Houston, in Alabama, who they run the science payloads, in Japan. Normally we don't talk to Canada, but we could, and in Europe. So we're talking to all these different people on Earth throughout the day, from the time we have our first meeting of the day until the time we finish at the end of the day, from 7:30 to 7 roughly. But we also have email. So you can't escape email even in space. And so throughout the day, there's emails coming up from your friends and family, but also from work. The flight director, your boss in the astronaut office, they'll email you different things. And then they would set up a Skype, basically sort of like a Zoom call, every weekend with your friends or family. And then there's also a phone system. So when you have the right satellite connection, there's a internet phone, just like a lot of apps that you have on your cell phone can do telephone calls through the internet. The space station has a similar system, so you can make phone calls, but only when you have the right connection, which is about maybe 2/3 of the time.
All right, we have one more student who's joining us today. We're going to go and find Jonathan. Jonathan's 11. He's in Freehold, New Jersey. Let's get that microphone turned on. Hey, Jonathan.
Hi. So my question is, what is the coolest thing you learned in space?
The coolest thing I wore?
You learned in space.
It's the internet connection's bad. That I wore, like what uniforms that I wear?
No, like what is the coolest thing you learned?
Oh, learned. Okay, there you go. That is a very interesting question. I literally don't think anybody's ever asked me, what did I learn in space? I learned a lot about all these science experiments. I learned a lot about photography and filmmaking. That was kind of one of the focuses I had. Here's an obscure thing that I learned. Samantha was doing this project. She had a clear ball, and she put her physicist friend wanted to study particle physics. So they put a bunch of particles in this ball, and you could watch them interact and bounce off each other. She was using M&Ms and like breath mints and candies. So just these little hard things bouncing around. And she would film it and, oh, that's interesting. And then she'd let it sit there on the wall. And one day I floated by and all the M&Ms had fallen to the bottom. But that doesn't make any sense because everything's floating. Why is it falling to the bottom? That can't be true. So I shook it up and I let it sit there for a few minutes. And after a few minutes, everything fell to the bottom. And it blew me away. I brought my crewmates and we all just stared at it like we couldn't believe what was happening. This didn't make sense to our brains. And so what was happening, there's this thing called gravity gradient. When you grow up and learn physics, there's the center of gravity. There's like the very center point of the space station. And if you're even a couple of feet away from that point in the space station, this ball of M&Ms, all of the M&Ms would move away from the center of the space station. And it only took them a few minutes to stabilize them. And that was really wild. It makes sense physics-wise, it makes sense. But it was an unexpected discovery that we made. So I went around with a camera and I took all these pictures in different locations for future physics professors in college or whatever that want to teach this lesson about gravity gradient and orbits. But basically the point is the M&Ms are in a little slightly different orbit than the space station. So they tend to move in a different direction. And that was one of the coolest things I learned in space.
Okay, that's pretty interesting.
It was very, very good question.
All right, very cool. So Terry, Patty is wondering on YouTube about if you can tell us a little bit about One More Orbit and if there's any updates.
One More Orbit, I'm wearing my patch right now. So we're actually in the process of trying to get distribution for that. So to put it on Netflix or whoever, get some type of distribution so people can see it. I've actually got my, here's my One More Orbit picture for our crew that we had. And here is my, the One More Orbit airplane as we were coming into land. So One More Orbit is a movie that I directed last year. And we set a world record flying around Earth. We started off at the Kennedy Space Center. We went over the North Pole and South Pole and came back to the Kennedy Space Center. It was on the anniversary of the Apollo 11 mission. So it was a movie about exploration and how that can bring people together and unite people. There was a pretty cool environmental thing about how to make things like that carbon negative, which is really important. So it was a really fun movie. You can see a trailer on my YouTube channel if you want to see it, on the Terry Virts YouTube channel. And it's still in work, so we're trying to shop it. We had some meetings and then the virus hit and everything kind of went on hold a couple months ago. So we'll see. Hopefully it comes out this year. We'll see.
All right, and we're gonna grab one or two more questions from our live audience today. If you have another question you're just dying to ask Terry, let's get a hand up here so I know who to come and visit. Who's got a question they've been saving for us? All right, so looks like Colin wants to ask one. Let's go visit Colin in Salt Lake City.
What feeling were you feeling most when you were like boarding the spaceship?
The feelings that I had boarding the spaceship. So the first night I was getting on the space shuttle, I was kind of nervous. I wasn't afraid about the flight. I probably should have been, but I wasn't. I was more afraid of would I be able to do it? I mean, because it was all new. I'd never left Earth before. And it was this just foreign experience of getting strapped in, and it's such a big deal. And the space shuttle is this massive 200-foot tall, 4 million pound rocket. And I was the pilot. Like I wasn't the commander. I was kind of like the number 2 guy, but I had to fly it. It made me pretty nervous, to be honest. And then they canceled it because there was some bad weather. So we went back and we had to go do the whole thing again the next night. And the second night, I was much more at ease. It was just emotionally, it was a lot easier for me because I had just done it. But then, getting into space, when I got into space, my feeling was, wow, it was so overpoweringly beautiful and alien. I was floating. I've never done that before. And it was this just crazy experience. So I really had to focus. I had to take a lot of effort to make sure I was focusing on, all right, you got to fly the space shuttle. There's Earth, that's the most beautiful thing you've ever seen, but focus on flying the space shuttle. So there's a lot of emotions that you feel there for sure.
All right, and Faisal, do you have one more for us?
You have a question?
What's your favorite thing about space?
My favorite thing about space. Okay, that's an easier one because people ask me this a lot. So I love floating. That's really cool. But my favorite thing is the view. And there's just so many amazing things. Some of my photos are on my website if you want to see some, terryvirts.com if you'd like pictures. But just the view is awesome. I just showed you some in the presentation we did. I could go back there and film movies all day long.
All right, Terry, we're going to take one more from YouTube, and it's a science one. Can you give us an example of a science experiment you worked on the space station?
So many that I did. I talked about the E. coli and salmonella. Here was a really cool one. There's something called CFE, capillary flow experiment. NASA has to have an acronym for everything. But capillary flow, you look it up, you can Google it. And they wanted to find out how fluids behave in space. And so I had a jar. It's kind of like, this is my water bottle. It was kind of like that. And inside the water bottle, there was a vein. So it's like a spatula with brownie mix. So the jar was full, about half full of a liquid. It was a silicon fluid, so this really thick fluid. And I put the vein down in there and I rotated it. And imagine sticking a spatula in brownie mix and just rotating it. The brownie mix will get pushed around. But then when I got to when I rotated it a certain amount, all of a sudden the fluid went and it shot to the top of the jar. And it didn't make any sense. That doesn't make any sense to me. But it's a really cool property of liquids. It's called capillary flow. And one of the things you can do if you own a satellite company and you want to get every drop of gas out of the satellite, because satellites cost millions of dollars and you don't want to waste it, and having pressurized fancy fuel tanks are expensive, maybe just rotating the fuel tank is one way to get all of the fuel out. So it was a really interesting experiment. It was something I didn't expect. And that was one of probably 50 really cool stuff that I did.
All right. Well, I want to start off with a huge thank you to YouTube. We had hundreds of groups joining us on YouTube from all across North America. Thank you for sending us in such great questions. I want to give a huge shout out to the boys and girls who joined us from across the US today on camera. Thank you so much for your awesome questions. Thank you, Jonathan, Izzy, Faisal, Preston, and Colin. I want to give a shout out to COVID Promise. So thank you so much for helping to make this event happen. So to make your COVID promise, take a moment and visit www.covidpromise.org. And of course, Terry, it's always great when we're able to do one of these live events, especially during this time when students are looking for activities and fun people to hang out with. So thanks so much for giving us some of your time to make this happen today.
Thank you, Joe, for doing this. This is really cool. And I know this has been the craziest school year of all time. So hopefully the kids enjoyed it.
All right. Well, one more shout out to everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. We're going to sign off for today. I'm going to unmute the microphones. So our 5 friends joining us, nice and loud. A goodbye and thank you. And then we'll sign off for today.
Thank you and goodbye.
Bye.
Thanks, guys. See ya.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank
Thanks
you.
again, everyone. Signing off for
Thank
today.
you.